Good afternoon, and profuse apologies from Andrew that he can't be here. He rang me yesterday morning and said, could I cover for him? I left the Royal Navy on Monday after 25 years of service. I'm in my 4th day of being a civilian, and I had an empty diary, so I'm really pleased to be here. So Andrew and I worked together in Afghanistan, in, I guess you could call it, the cauldron of military ops. As you can see there, I was a naval officer. I'm not a behavioural scientist. But we were concerned that some of the issues on the ground in Afghanistan perhaps didn't readily find solutions in conventional military thinking. And in particular, we were of the view that we really still, despite a long enduring presence there, didn't understand Afghans in the way that we should have done. So we thought about this very deeply in advance of the deployment that Andrew led into Afghanistan, into Helmand province in late 2007. We exercised some of those thoughts on that deployment, and we've then carried on that thinking to produce this book, which I'm going to blatantly plug because I get not a penny from it, nor does Andrew. Everything goes to Help for Heroes, so please buy in as big a volumes as you possibly can. So the first thing I want to do is introduce you to the Afghan people. Oh, not that lot. That's the lot you see all the time. That is the vocal minority. Not interested in them. They can't be changed. This is the lot we're interested in. Normal, everyday people. The passive majority who get very little public profile in the media coverage that you see here, but who form the majority of our interactions in Afghanistan. They're normal people. They're just like you and me. They have the same hopes and aspirations. Well, not entirely. I hope to have a Ferrari in my garage one day. They don't. They have more basic aspirations like food on the table each day, healthcare for their children, education, and above all else, after 30, 40, 50 years of terrible conflict in that country, they want peace and they want stability. That is what motivates most Afghans across that huge and incredibly beautiful country. They are not ideologically linked to the Taliban. But here's a key thing. They don't automatically buy in to what the Afghan government says, nor do they automatically buy in to what we've been saying. They see the improvements for sure, but they're the world's greatest pragmatists. They pick and choose the best bits offered. And in some instances, the Taliban were offering good, solid, immediate justice on the ground over basic disputes over land drainage and ownership of cattle and things like that, which the government didn't still have the capacity at that stage to deal with. So they were the world's ultimate pragmatists. Much more than that, we decided that actually they were a contested audience. And we had to bring them on board. That was the essence of our journey and delving into the world of behavioural science and more broadly social science. So our journey began early in 2007 when Andrew told he was going to be the commander of British forces in Afghanistan and asked me if I would assist him with some of his thinking. This was about 14 months after we'd first gone into Helmand, and up until that point there'd been a lot of heavy fighting. It's fair to say that most of the engagement in Afghanistan at that stage had been kinetic. It had involved the application of hard military force. Now, as we were thinking about going there in late 2007, one of the views that we formed was that military success might not actually be the determining factor for the country. That in securing consent of the population, we might need to find other tools in the toolkit. And so we began looking around. In particular, Andrew became a vociferous reader of behavioural economics books. And we were both very taken by the fact that a lot of reports were coming back from Afghanistan to say that people behaved irrationally. And we wondered about that. In fact, we wondered if actually they were behaving completely rationally within the boundaries of the environment, the hard physical conditions, and the terrible environment of violence in which they lived. So perhaps we couldn't describe them as irrational, it's just that we were looking at them through the wrong lens. So we were absolutely convinced that this was our prize, that we had to bring people on board. Now, that involved changing the mindset of our soldiers, sailors, and airmen. About 7,500 troops were going into Afghanistan on this deployment. And they all had different views. Some had been before, some had not. But they all had different views of that deployment. And we needed to change the view that they weren't just going there for a hard military fight, but that these people were central, and perhaps fighting wouldn't necessarily be the key. So, with the idea that the population was the prize, that we had to secure it, we had to do a whole host of very unconventional military things. And one of those was to start changing the lexicon of the way that we spoke to our people and the people regarded the conflict, the environment that they were going to for their 6-month tour. And up until that point, most of the lexicon was very military. It was very hard-hitting. And we felt that was probably counterproductive and that needed to be changed. And Andrew was insistent that we had a new lexicon that permeated all of our documents, all of our orders, all of our commands. And to reinforce that, he did something very unusual. He took officers and soldiers out at every level of his structure, from the top to the bottom. And he said, right, I've removed all of your other duties. You are now just responsible for influence. You are going to be the red team. You are going to be the counter view to everything that you see going on at your respective levels. I want you to adjudicate that against the prize, against the population. Now, this was a difficult concept to give to people, particularly people who have been in the military for a long period of time. Very new, very innovative, and we had decided that innovation would be the key to success out there. So, we changed the lexicon, and we had introduced a new layer, not I hope of bureaucracy, but a new layer of thinking that hadn't existed previously. Now, the interesting thing about that is as you began to change the lexicon, as you began to think differently, you started to think about the entire environment. If you began thinking about the conflict from the perspective of the population, you started to question a whole host of other things. You began to ask more and more questions. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? What's the reasoning behind this? And one of the biggest questions that we asked was, why are we trying to market ourselves, UK forces, NATO forces, why are we trying to market ourselves like a commercial product? Because that's what we were doing, and this was not a commercial environment. So, for example, they're lovely, little soft, fluffy yellow ducks, and they've got ISAF's logo on. We had thousands of them to give to kids. Why were we doing that? Why were we marketing ISAF with a little soft yellow duck? First of all, it didn't look like anything that they would have seen before, so they probably weren't quite sure what it was. But secondly, it had that blasted logo on the front. And unfortunately, that logo could get kids killed if they came across the wrong Taliban on a bad day. So this was not good stuff. So we started looking at that, this idea of freebies, giveaways, advertising, the sort of commercialization that was going on. And then we took a broader look at all the billboards that were being used around the country. And we began to realize that the entire focus of that side of the campaign was on attitudes. Everything was trying to persuade the contested population, the Afghans, to like ISAF, to like the Kabul government. And yet the reality of their life was they might choose not to. We'd already found that they were the ultimate pragmatists. Why would they? Because very often ISAF or the Afghan government weren't doing things that they wanted. We also knew from our very immature research, and I said at the beginning, I'm not a social scientist, but we also knew from our research that attitudes seemed to be quite poor predictors of behavior. What we wanted was behavioral change. We wanted to have really solid changes in the way the population conducted themselves, i.e. they chose not to grow poppy, or they chose not to harbour fugitives, or not to support bomb makers. And to be honest with you, we didn't think this was the way forward. Now, I'm sure you're all fluent Pashtun speakers, and immediately I could pick any one of you and you would tell me exactly what that says. I'll save it. It says, poppy is the enemy of the Pashtu. And then it invites, I haven't got a laser pointer on this, but you can see there's a phone number underneath. It invites the person watching it, reading it, to ring a telephone number to report the presence of growing poppy fields. There were 299 of these centrally funded boards across Afghanistan at an annual cost of $4.9 million per year to retain them. What's wrong with that? Most people don't read to start with. Secondly, is it really the enemy? Actually, poppy was a massive cash crop for most people, twice a year, a crop they couldn't do without. Thirdly, what happens when they rang the phone number? Unfortunately, the capacity of the security forces was so low at the time, the organic security forces, it was never answered. And finally, philosophically, it just struck us as wrong. So we didn't want any of that stuff. We wanted a true behavioural approach. And our opportunity came towards the middle of the deployment when the emblematic town of Musa Qala had to be retaken. It had been held up as a headquarters for the Taliban Islamic Emirates. It was embarrassing. We needed to retake it. And Andrew was very conscious that the town just 30 kilometers away, Nawazad, had been almost flattened through kinetic activity. 15,000 people were without homes and without businesses. We saw the Taliban headquarters at Musa Qala not as a military target, but as somebody's home, somebody's social environment, somebody's businesses. And so we decided to adopt a different approach to retake Musa Qala that used all the possible levers of influence that we had available. Some came straight from behavioural economics textbooks, others were those that we had refined in theatre. That was successful. And one of the key points about that town there, which I know it looks as though it's all fallen down, but that is actually the town in its normal state. The key point about that was when it was finally liberated. It was liberated not by us, but by Afghans, and within an hour of liberating, the Afghan flag was put on top of that tower. Within 48 hours, the marketplace, the souk, was open again. People were returning back to their homes, and people were trading. Now, that came about because conceptually we had said we needed a different approach. And Andrew was quite adamant as the commander of British forces that he would place, and this was the key, he would place conventional military operations as the supporting element to a more behaviourally focused approach. So, on return, we began looking at this in more detail, trying to understand what had happened. Had we done the right thing? Was there more that we could learn? And critically, was there more that our colleagues who would deploy after us and to different parts of the world could learn? And we felt that there was. We felt there had been far too much attention placed on informational, attitudinal communication and not enough on behavioural. So we did a lot of work. We worked with the Behavioural Dynamics Institute, who have done a lot of work with governments in this area, to see if there was more that we could do and learn. We decided that there was. We became very interested in the science of target audience analysis, and in particular through the BDI, the way that particular groups could be profiled, the way that particular strategies could be modelled on those profiles on a traffic light system, and you could see if they were going to be good or if they were going to be bad. All of that is what we put into the book. More than that, the website will soon have a paper that we've written that we hope hoovers up some more of these ideas but puts them into the commercial domain. Both Andrew and I are now out of the military, and we're working with, for example, international extractive industries in dealing with some of the human issues that they have, particularly in their development projects in Africa, particularly in their areas of corporate social responsibility. Because we think some of the lessons that we learned from Afghanistan in dealing with people and dealing with behaviours rather than attitudes would have resonance there. So do please visit the website. That paper will be online fairly shortly. And I think I have reached my time. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.